Hi, Eric Meyer here, speaking to you from Build Conference in Belfast, and about to talk about the future of the web and how everything will change. Enjoy.
Thanks. So in case anyone was wondering, there was a memo that we all had to wear a sport coat with jeans and sneakers. So that's why you've been seeing that anyway. Good afternoon. So I'd like to talk about, like it says up there, a more tangled web. And I have lots of slides to get through, although not as many as Wilson. So I'm going to get right to it. The first thing I want to say, though, about the web is not necessarily that it's going to get more tangled, but that the web has won. Okay? And it's not just me who says that, although I'm perfectly happy to take credit for it. Tweet away. In fact, a vice president at Google said this on stage at the Google I/O conference this past spring. Okay? Of course, you might think that's really nothing interesting coming from Google because the web's kind of what they're all about, right? But they're stretching the web in some very interesting ways, some of which I'm going to talk about this afternoon. And I think they're kind of uniquely placed to see where things are going. Because of all the stuff that they're doing, not just sort of on the web, but getting us onto the web. And no, this is not going to be a talk about Google. But if you look at it, the web, by which I mean its technologies, the sort of underlying components of the web, show up in all kinds of interesting and unexpected, in lots of ways, places. As an example, maybe some of you have used this chat client. It's called Adium. Anyone? Okay, cool. This is a multi-service chat client, kind of like Trillium on Windows. It's a Mac client. And it has these themes, right? And the default themes that come with it are, the one kind of replicates iChat, one of them kind of replicates MSN Messenger for no clear reason. And none of them were what I wanted. Because I like this kind of thing, really compact. And don't show me bubbles and little icons and like waving stuff to little smiley faces. I don't need that crap. I just want to chat with somebody and then be done with it because IM is really disruptive, right? So I wanted to make my own theme because I couldn't find any themes that were as minimal as I wanted. And the themes come as packages, OS 10 little files. So I did show package contents and I went digging around in it. It's like, wait a minute, there's HTML here, and CSS files. This is the web. I know this, right? So I made my own theme using HTML and CSS because the appearance of every chat window in Adium is run by HTML and CSS, okay? It's a sort of a variabilized form of HTML. You have to put in sort of a special syntax, this is where the message goes, and this is where like the person's name goes. But still, wrapped around it, you can use any markup you want. You can use p tags, you can use divs, you can use DLs. I think I used like DTDD, right? The term was the person, and the definition was what they said. But anyway, that's what I came up with, and I baked in some micro formats and whatever, okay? So a chat client, okay? And you can do stuff like this, right, with that chat client. Or like this, for those of you who are fans of Star Trek, The Next Generation, and later. Okay, this is, again, an Adium theme. I did not do this one. I did the simple one. But again, HTML, CSS, and obviously some images, okay? And this is from a few years ago. Other places it shows up. The Kindle. You guys have the Kindle over here yet? I know there's been some complaints. Okay, so it's made it over here. I don't actually have one, but I have a friend who does, and so I sort of played with it. But to publish a book, or to publish anything on the Kindle, you use basically a subset of HTML and a subset of CSS. And it's also actually kind of interesting that Kindle can consume RSS feeds, right? So it can become sort of a feed reader. And again, it's reaching out over HTTP and grabbing an RSS feed and then a little bit of CSS to present it. And of course, the iPhone, you know, woohoo. How many of you have iPhones? Okay, yeah. It's crazy. I have an iPhone too. Even though where I live, AT&T really sucks. But anyway, so right, so you know, you've got a full web browser right there in the iPhone. But this Apple kind of they had, I don't know if it was a brilliant move or if it was just sort of the logical next step. Once you had a device like this, they said, you know what, we could, rather than having the specialized web browsing thing built into the phone where all you see is text, kind of like the BlackBerry and previous phones had, we can just have the browser pretend it's a tiny little desktop monitor, right? And then we'll zoom everything out and sort of do the cool anti-aliasing and, you know, Quartz, OpenGL, whatever. And then you can zoom in. But right, the iPhone doesn't really pretend to be a mobile device. It pretends to be a monitor that just happens to fit in your pocket, right? So it does lack flash, right? But that kind of underscores the point that I'm sort of making here, and that Mr. Gundatra of Google was making. It doesn't support Flash, but it supports all of the technologies of the web. It supports HTML and CSS and JavaScript, okay? Apple does not limit their use of these technologies to, you know, cool browsers on cool, you know, breakthrough revolutionary internet devices or whatever it is. Dashboard widgets, also HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and images where necessary. The calendar, for example. I actually got an email from someone at Apple saying, hey, do you happen to know of a way to do a monthly calendar without tables? And I said, yes, but I don't recommend it. And they said, no, it's okay, just can you show us? I was like, okay, so here's the URL, but these are the reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. Like, no, it's cool, don't worry. And then, as I found out later, for some reason, they were doing tableless monthly calendars for their calendar application, which I still think was a mistake, but you know, they have $15 billion in the bank, and I don't, so that'll, you know, take my opinion for what that's worth. And you know, so again, technologies of the web. Even, anyone here either bought or looked at iTunes LP? Anyone? Yeah, okay, everyone in the front. Everyone in the back is like, no. Who remembers LPs? Oh, yeah, see, there you go. You kids. Jeez. So when I was your age, we got music and it was on platters this big. Okay, anyway, 23 minutes per side. Okay, so they have this thing called iTunes LP, and if you open up an iTunes LP package, it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Okay? I mean, the iTunes Store itself runs on some bizarre version of those technologies, but the LPs actually use this set of technologies, which is what I mean by the web has won. It's everywhere now, right? It's in everything. Next, it's going to be running our coffee makers. As limited and clumsy and frustrating as these things can be, in some ways, their very limitations and their very simplicity are what allowed them to win. Okay. So let me talk about those technologies for a minute. You know, HTML, which is the base language of the web, basically its foundation, is actually evolving. It has some very interesting goals, many of which are to add more semantics to markup, but some of the goals are to make the development of web applications easier. Okay, so sort of modifying the markup language so that web applications will be simpler to do. So things like the video element, right? So instead of having to have 16 bizarre nested levels of object and embed and this fallback and that fallback, you can just say video, src equals blah, and you're done. Now, of course, that's not going to happen overnight, and they've defined 16 bizarre levels of fallback just so that we can sort of get over the hump. But eventually, we'll have the ability to just say video or audio and point at the thing, and you're done. Okay. So you know, there's all this cool stuff that they're doing, and that should all be done by 2022. Actually, 13 years from now. Woo! If that seems ludicrous to you, it actually shouldn't. Let me put this on a timeline, okay? I'll round up to the beginning of 2010 because we're almost there for a start point. So that would leave us 12 years to get to 2022, right? To be completely done with HTML5, as in, you know, it works consistently across browsers, and there are no more changes to the language, and we're all done, okay? 12 years. Let's consider its predecessor, HTML4. So if we started in 1998, HTML4 was finalized in December of 97, but I'll round that up to 98. 12 years from that is 2010, okay? Guess what? HTML does not meet the criteria that HTML5 has set for itself of interoperability and being done and really no more need to change. You know, the language isn't being touched anymore. They're not changing it, but it's not interoperable, which seems stupid, right? It's been 12 years. How long does it take to get something as dead, you know, rock simple as HTML4 right? Even things as fundamental as white space handling are not consistent between browsers. We deal with that, well, we actually look past it every day, right? The fact that a carriage return, a new line in a certain place can cause different rendering, different layout in different browsers. We just kind of skate on past that because we've had 12 years to get used to it, right? But HTML5's goals are to not have those sorts of inconsistencies, so that white space handling is exactly the same in every user agent that consumes HTML5. That the way that they handle video and audio is exactly the same, and you know, within a certain set of parameters, in every agent that can consume HTML5. Okay, so this actually is kind of an ambitious schedule. It's not. If it's ludicrous, it's in the. They think they'll be done that soon, right? Having reached that end state. So I'll be very interested to see if they hit the deadline, and you know, I'll start waiting now. Anyway, the thing is that you don't have to wait till 2022 to use HTML5. You could use it today. Not all of it, but some of it. Canvas has been widely used for a couple years now. Well, widely. Has been reliably used for a couple of years, and there are ways to make sure that it works all right in older browsers. So that's HTML5. How about CSS3? Let's put that on a timeline. This is as precise as I can be. Because here's the thing. CSS3 is not CSS3. It's a whole bunch of modules, okay, that can develop independently. So what I would really have to do is put up a timeline for each module. This is only representative. This is not to scale, let's say, because yes, I have all these question marks. But this is a list of the CSS modules. There's an even 50 of them. Still going. Still going. There you go. Hi, Bert. Okay. Bert Boss, chair of the W3C CSS working group. Yeah, so that's a list of all of the modules. Now, if you, maybe in the back you couldn't see that, but the vast majority of them are marked low priority. Now, I don't know how many of you have experience with working groups, but anything marked low priority never gets touched, basically. Medium and high priority things actually get worked on. Now, some of those things, like the CSS selectors module, which is in the high priority thing, let me skip back. If you look up here at high priority, CSS level 2 revision 1 is at candidate recommendation stage. And that sounds really awesome until you realize it's basically been at that stage for the last 5 years. Selectors is in last call, and that's actually one that's been moving at a decent clip and is actually, you know, I don't have to be too snarky about. Because it's moved along and it's basically gotten to the point of, you know, unless someone comes up with some show-stopping, oh my God, you guys didn't realize this and it will break the web forever kind of problem, then this will move to candidate recommendation, and then at candidate recommendation, there's weird shenanigans to get it out of candidate recommendation into proposed recommendation, and I don't really want to get into all that, but it stands a decent chance of being there soon because there are already almost complete interoperable implementations of it. The mobile profile is a candidate recommendation because mobile profiles are really great, and CSS marquee, yes. That's high priority. Again, to those of you without experience dealing with working groups, that probably seems really weird, but as someone who spent several years in a working group, that doesn't seem weird at all. Sad, but not weird. But then you have all these medium priority things that I'm not gonna go through all of them one by one. And you can see some of them are at candidate recommendation and some of them are at working draft status and, you know, blah, blah, blah. And then when you get down to the low priority, everything's in working draft status, basically, except for CSS TV profile 1.0. Apparently that was important to somebody. Okay, so, like I say, and even 50 modules. So the advancement of CSS is really a lot like a marathon, complete with the staggering dehydrated people at the end of the 26 miles that you just want the medics to pull them off the course, and they keep waving them off, and it's really sort of sad and pathetic. This is kind of what CSS development is like now, which makes for an interesting spectacle at times, but also makes it really hard for me to say, and in 2047, we'll finally have CSS3. The only way that we could, I think, possibly ever have a monolithic CSS3 is if at some point somebody says, okay, these are all the CSS modules that have reached these certain stages, and we're just gonna put them all in a document, and we're gonna plunk it down on the table and say, look, CSS3, yay, okay? Which, who knows if they'll do that or not. You may recall that this is also what was done with XHTML. It was also modularized, and things were gonna be done at different paths. Yeah, that didn't really work out. So, you know, good luck to the guy in blue, I guess. So let's talk about something a little more exciting, more of a horse race, right? Web browsers, woohoo, ACID 3, and people are passing, and okay, I don't really care that much about ACID 3. What I do care about is what's happening with browsers and how fast they're advancing. ACID 3 was an interesting little sort of sub-horse race. Imagine if you had a horse race and then one of the horses like all gave birth on the track and then you had a race with the foals, right? That was the ACID 3 test race. And then back to the main race, which is what I'm really interested in. I mean, the foals are cute and all, right? You know, kind of wobbling and stumbling around and all that stuff. And one of them's running the wrong way. But I'm more interested in which of the horses is going to win because, you know, I have money on those. Right. So actually, we have a new entrant in the horse race, fairly new, Google Chrome. And okay, I have to ask, is it just me, or is the logo for Google Chrome kind of like Simon crossed with Hal when he's like really depressed? I mean, that's sort of my vision of the Google Chrome logo, is a sad, malevolent AI that forces me to follow a given pattern that just gets longer and longer. All right, I'm sorry. I promise not to work out my therapy on stage. Anyway, Google Chrome. Actually, what's interesting to me is the name they picked. Because the name Chrome implies that the browser itself is Chrome for something else, right? We're used to browser Chrome being the stuff around the edges of the window, and in the window is where all the cool stuff happens. Well, from a terminology point of view, Google's kind of taken that a step forward or backward, I guess, depending on your perspective, and said the browser itself is Chrome for something else. And that something else can be whatever we want it to be. right? It could be a rendering engine, or they're talking now about building an operating system based on Chrome, which is a web browser. Supposedly they're going to ship it. They supposedly had released it a couple weeks ago. Like, all of a sudden, Twitter explodes, like, oh my God, Chrome's out! And then, oh, wait, no, sorry. That's somebody pretending to have the Chrome OS out, but it's actually like a Linux, some weird Linux distribution. Anyway, but, 15 years ago, Mark Andreessen, anyone remember that name? Yeah. And Sun Microsystems, again, anyone remember that name? We're talking about how the web would become this, just like the web would be the operating system, right? And we would all compute on the web, and we wouldn't really have like Windows and Mac, well, then it was System 7 or whatever. We would do everything in the web, right? The web would be the operating system, and it would like crush Microsoft and blah, blah, blah. And it's possible they were right. They were just 15 years too early, okay? We'll see. And if I had to guess, I would say that the web is not going to crush those operating systems so much as operating systems will become Chrome by which we access the web OS, if I had to guess. Now, that's kind of long term, but if I had to guess, that's what I would say. So anyway, at the moment, Chrome the browser actually is Chrome to WebKit, right? That's the rendering engine that drives Chrome. Google didn't go out and make their own browser exactly. They took an existing rendering engine and built stuff around it and improved it and sort of modified it to their own needs. But again, that sort of emphasizes what I was saying, that to them, their browser, it's not about the rendering engine. They don't feel like they have to have their own rendering engine so they can be in the cool club or whatever, right? They can optimize that for the kinds of things that they think are important, which, unsurprisingly enough, are web applications. Because, Google Docs, anyone use Google Docs? Google Maps, stuff like that, right? All of that stuff runs on HTML and CSS and JavaScript, right? The stuff, so they made a browser that was better at those things, but they based it on somebody else's work, okay? The interesting part to me is that they could, at some point, decide, yeah, you know what, we don't really like WebKit anymore. Let's replace it with something else, like the rendering engine in the Gecko line that drives Firefox and so on. It seems kind of deliberately engineered to allow that kind of thing. And I think it would be just fascinating to see what would happen if someday they said, yeah, we're kind of done with WebKit. We're going to use somebody else's rendering engine. Everyone goes, what? Chrome used to act like this, and now it acts like this? Oh, my God. Right. Like we don't have enough trouble. Anyway, of course, the iPhone uses WebKit, and it's all over the place. And is that for me? No? Okay. Because I was expecting a call. I just wanted to be sure. Right, so, like I said, you've got the iPhone that has WebKit, and it's this nice little browser in there, and it's showing up in, on iPhones, and it's now showing up in Android phones. So obviously it's gaining a lot of penetration, and I could easily see other people building around it. And then you've got Opera, which has Opera Mobile, which is on basically every other phone besides the iPhone and Android, like 27 kajillion different brands of phone. Representative sample. So, right, so you have sort of this struggle happening in the mobile space, and of course that's really important because mobile is growing much faster than desktop at this point. Mobile users are, and desktop users are kind of, whatever, right? But what's kind of weird is that the rendering engines that started on the desktop are now moving into the mobile space. Now, one of the things that I think is going to really complicate our lives, and I think it's been touched on today, is it's one thing to have a mobile device with a screen that's let's say it's that big. And it's another thing to have like a desktop screen, right? There's substantial differences in how deal with that. You know, to take it to the extremes, you know, you've got your great big TV, and then, you know, the iPod is, you know, has this tiny little screen. And how would you design for both? Now, I am not a designer. I will freely admit this. My design skills can be most charitably described as minimalist. And so, you know, I have no idea how you could design for both of those simultaneously. And there's a part of me that thinks maybe you shouldn't. But that's what's going to really be interesting. You know, is there a way to bridge that gap? And hopefully someone can tell us. But if there isn't, then, you know, we're going to have to sort of create almost separate sites, which I hate saying, because I remember back when we had to make one site for Explorer and the other site for Netscape Navigator, and they had like little badges. It's, you know, Netscape Now, and this site best viewed in, you know, Internet Explorer 10,024 by 768 with 256 colors or more, you know, which eventually, I mean, if that had persisted much longer, we would have eventually just all had the same badge. It would have said, this site best viewed on my computer, right? So come on over, you can see it as it was meant to be, and then you can go on your merry way. That'll be $50, thank you. Which would have been a great revenue stream. Anyway, so, you know, what are browsers going to do? How are we going to bridge this gap between mobile and desktop and, you know, giganto screens? And like I say, I don't have an answer, but that's one of the interesting things, and I think that's going to be one of the major challenges for the next few years. But then there's a question of, you know, how are we going to make interfaces better? Okay, you know, CSS is staggering along, you know, marathon style, and the browsers are in this big horse race. But the horse race isn't about necessarily, I mean, the main horse race isn't who can implement the most standards. It's who can make the fastest browser, right? Massive amounts of engineering have been, in the last couple of years, have been going into making JavaScript engines faster and faster and faster and faster. And they are now literally, over the last couple of years, like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude faster within a given browser line, right? So, I mean, when Chrome was introduced, when the browser came out, Google had, you know, paid Scott McCloud of Understanding Comics fame, well, fame in the US anyway. Scott McCloud, familiar name? Okay. So he wrote a thing called Understanding Comics, and he's a comic artist himself, and is hugely influential among comic artists that I know. So, you know, take that for what it's worth. Anyway, they had him create a comic about, like, introducing Google Chrome, right? Which is weird in a way. You know, it's a web browser. How much do we really need to know? But one of the things they spent time talking about was the JavaScript engine and virtualization. And they didn't just spend 1 page on it. They actually spent like 5 pages talking about all the optimizations and improvements they made in JavaScript to the WebKit engine, right? Because that's where it's at right now. Okay? The WebKit team has themselves been putting lots and lots of effort into making the rendering engine, the JavaScript engine, excuse me, in WebKit better and better and better, right? For a while it was called Squirrelfish, which had like the greatest mascot logo ever. Just search for Squirrelfish, you will not be disappointed. They've recently changed it to Nitro, probably because the higher ups, the PR people at Apple were like, yeah, it's really faster. We need to promote the fact that our JavaScript engine is so fast. What's that called? Wait, it's called what? No. We're not putting Squirrelfish on our webpage. So it's called Nitro now. Lame. Okay. Squirrelfish. The Firefox team has been putting massive amounts of effort into making their engine faster, their JavaScript engine faster. And they're talking, there's all this stuff going back and forth that I just barely sort of get an impression of understanding, where they talk about, like, the JavaScript engine in Firefox, well, in the Gecko line was called SpiderMonkey. And then they introduced Trace something, so then it was called Trace Monkey. And anyway, like I say, I sort of get, they talk about, so we do this and it spawns off blah, 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 and I go, okay, I sort of in the same sense of a blind guy trying to figure out what the elephant is, right? I sort of get what you're talking about, maybe. But the end result is, oh my God, these are so fast, right? Which is crucial because, think about trying to do Google Maps in 1999 with the JavaScript engines of that era. I know, you could drag a map and it would have finished dragging about, wait for it, now. Okay, so, and we don't even think about anymore the fact that, Google Maps is basically like a desktop application or Google Docs or, Google Spreadsheet or whatever. So to me, the interesting thing here is that as far as I'm concerned, because of where things are going, the sort of the penetration of these technologies into all these different areas, and the speed with which rendering engines are being, the speed improvements that are being built into JavaScript engines, what we're really looking at here is the death of the plugin, okay, to be replaced with scripting. Because, think about it. A complete application, like a complete spreadsheet in your browser, or Google right now is working, well, not just Google, but Google and a number of people are working on a JavaScript framework for doing hardware-accelerated 3D in the browser. So it's not only a framework for doing 3D scenes and animations, but for directly addressing the graphics acceleration hardware in the computer to make that faster, okay? 10 years ago, if you wanted 3D at all, you had to download a plugin. And of course, did anyone ever download a plugin besides Flash and QuickTime? Basically, from a market perspective, no. Okay, I mean, yes, I know that many of you downloaded Cosmo Worlds or the wavelet compression plugin and blah, 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 but how many other people did, right? And those two plugins actually now, almost nobody ever downloads them except when they update, right? Those come with the browser. Okay, they're installed when you install the browser, or more likely, they were installed with the browser, which was installed with your operating system before you even bought your computer, right? So that you don't ever have to think about them. The only time you ever have to think about the Flash plugin is when your kids are playing on a mini clip or some games website, and this thing pops up that tells them they have to upgrade, and they go, "Mom, Dad, the game doesn't work." And you go over and you go, okay, upgrade, blah, blah, right? Like that. That's the only time you ever have to think about it. They're to the point now that I kind of think that they should stop being plugins and just bake them into the browser and be done with it. But anyway. So this is, JavaScript replacing plugins, basically. Now, we're kind of used to this when you think about it as developers. IE7JS, Dean Edwards, brilliant guy. How many of you have used this or seen it? Okay. So, what he did was he said, IE6 sucks when it comes to things like CSS, maybe for other reasons too, but the CSS is really bad, and it doesn't even understand basic HTML elements, but I could write JavaScript that will transparently make those things work. So he did, because he's completely brilliant. And so all you have to do is link to this JavaScript file, probably put it in conditional comments so that only Internet Explorer 6 or 5 ever sees it. And then it makes IE6 act like IE7, and you don't have to do bizarre stuff in your CSS. You just write your CSS normally and stop worrying about the fact that IE6 doesn't understand attribute selectors because the JavaScript makes it understand attribute selectors. Okay? And he's updated it since. There's now actually IE8JS, which does that. It basically takes IE5 through IE7 and brings them up to IE8's level of CSS and HTML handling. This is amazing. This is one of the many inheritors of that mantle. Farouk Atesh, formerly of Apple, created Modernizer, which sort of straddles the line between the past and the future. It looks for the browser's support of not only advanced CSS2, but also CSS3 stuff like rounded corners and what else? Oh, CSS animations and box shadow and 2D transforms and stuff like that. And basically it says, okay, if your browser doesn't support this, I'm going to do some back-end JavaScript juggling to make it work. Okay, again, transparently. It's the kind of stuff that plugins used to do, right? Plugins used to fix our browsers. But we don't need plugins anymore for that stuff. And that lowers the barrier a lot more because in the past, the whole problem with plugins, of course, was that, oh, well, users don't download plugins. Well, users' browsers will download JavaScript, whether they like it or not, basically, unless they've done the disable JavaScript thing. So, you know, it's sort of the difference between trying to get all of your users to download the free font that you're trying to use for your web design and install it in their computers just so your website can look nice, or having at font face, and then it just happens for them, okay? That's what we're looking at here. This is another one that got mentioned earlier today by Mark, Kafan, which is short for customized fonts, which is why I pronounce it that way. I know it has like a grave accent somewhere, but the creators of the script have admitted that they just did it because it looked nice. But anyway, this is replaced text. Cameron Mall, this is a test that he did using BicmScript Pro. But the point being that he's just basically referred to a JavaScript file, the Kafan.js, and then he said, you know, I want to use this font. And then it goes through and it looks for the bits that need to be replaced, you know, the need to use that font and just does it. Now you may have the flash of untypeset content, but that's the kind of thing that over time will get fixed. Either by more clever JavaScript or just faster browsers, faster JavaScript engines, okay? And then there's also TypeKit, which is sort of a third-party descendant, third-party version of Kafan where, you know, well, Mark talked about TypeKit and ClearLeft's thing and what they're doing, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But again, JavaScript is what drives these. You know, you can add vector drawing. This is a nice little JavaScript library called Raphael that lets you do stuff like that in the little example boxes there, right? Just by including this JavaScript and then throwing out a few directives. Similar to that is there's a library called Bluff. Apparently in Ruby, there's a graphing library called Gruff. They just ported it over to JavaScript. And so you just have, you know, a few little lines of specifying your data, and then it, you know, in one of your elements just draws the graph. And then there's processing, processing.js. Processing is a language that's really popular with what I call data artists, people who take data and then visualize it or do something interesting with it. There's a guy named Aaron Koblin who a couple years ago took the complete set of radar data for the entire continental United States for an entire 24 hours that he got from the FAA. I don't know how. Probably his local congressman has a freezer full of cash or something, but whatever. He got this data and he used processing to visualize it. And I don't put it in my slideshows because it's kind of low contrast because it's all arty and doesn't show up well on projector screens, but it's really fascinating. But you know, processing is meant to be this really simple language that non-programmers can pick up fairly easily, and then they can visualize, and it's built to visualize data. Ben Fry is someone who's done a lot with this. If you've ever seen the US zip code thing, where as you start typing in postcode numbers, it narrows down like where that could be in the US. He did that with processing. Anyway, John Resig of jQuery fame took processing and ported it to JavaScript. He took an entire programming language and redid it in JavaScript, and now you can have your browser just run processing programs, okay? Wow. I mean, took a language and basically added support for an entire programming language to browsers, no plugin. Okay. You know, Google Maps is I've mentioned it before, but it's another example of how JavaScript really made things incredible, because for a long time, mapping programs were the canonical example of why the web was a slow, clunky, silly little toy and it would never really amount to what desktop apps can do. Because desktop mapping programs were powerful. You could like drag around the map, and you could zoom in and out with the scroll wheel, and you could get directions and stuff like that. And the web versions were, if you wanted to move from this point to the east, you had to click on an arrow and wait for the image to reload, and then you had to click on an arrow again if it didn't go far enough. And who wants to do that, right? And then the Google Maps team created Google Maps, and all of a sudden it was like, wow, right? It completely changed that. And like I say, there are entire applications being built in CSS and JavaScript, including, and this isn't just at Google, there's a company named 280 North that created 280 Slides, which is basically Keynote. I mean, if you look at the interface, they were clearly inspired by Keynote. But this is a web application, right? It's in the browser. You can create your own slideshows and with that, all that kind of stuff. And the way that they did this was they took Objective-C, or at least large portions of Objective-C, which is a very popular programming language, at least among Mac programmers and just sort of in general. And again, ported it to JavaScript. It's, processing writ larger in a way. And then they released it as an open source framework. So, and their goal there was to say, we all know Objective-C, and we're really good at developing desktop applications in Objective-C. But browsers don't understand Objective-C. But if we ported it to JavaScript and called it Objective-J, which they did, then we can basically do really rapid desktop application development and then just sort of drop it on the web and we're good to go. I'm sure it's not quite that easy, but it makes developing for the web a lot easier than it used to be, at least for people who understand Objective-C. And here's that thing I was talking about, O3D, which is, again, offering access to the hardware acceleration. And the thing about this is, all this stuff that JavaScript is being extended to do, it's not just being extended to like hack stuff in the browser and make stuff in the browser better, but to make the browser itself better. Mozilla Labs recently came out with Jetpack, which lets you script the browser itself. So don't worry, you don't have to read all this. But this much JavaScript can be used to add a moving sparkline to the status bar of your browser to show you how many tabs you have open throughout the day, like what your trend line is for tabs open. So here we go. So they started with 0, and then at some point hit this peak, and right now they have 10 tabs open. Okay, maybe that's kind of silly. Maybe you don't need to know how many tabs you have open at any given time. But the point is that you can actually alter the browser itself using, again, JavaScript. So for that matter, you've got a complete web development environment in the form of Bespin, which was also developed by Mozilla Labs. And again, it's HTML and CSS and JavaScript. The interesting thing here being that this was developed at Mozilla Labs, but notice which browser it's running in. That would be Safari. Okay? So remember that whole, the web is the operating system and computers are just portals to that system? This has the possibility of being able to run a web development environment anywhere that you are with a computer and a web browser. And like all your files can be there and stuff, right? Now, this does bring up one thing that I think is very important, and it's part of what sort of makes all this more tangled. We do have to be careful, because if we're sloppy or unthinking in the way we do JavaScript, we create a great, big, huge accessibility barrier. Bespin is an example, which is the, and yes, that's a Empire Strikes Back reference. But Bespin is an example. It's a web editor, and it's completely in the browser, but it's also, at least from what I'm told by experts, completely inaccessible, right? If you are constrained to using a keyboard or you're blind, there's no way you can use it, okay? And that's a problem. There are ways to get around this. Jeremy Keith has talked about hijacks, which is a sort of an accessible way of doing Ajax. Admittedly, there will be things that by their nature just aren't accessible. But we've learned so much in the last 15 years about accessibility and how important it is, and how there's really rarely an excuse for ignoring it. And that's one of the things we're going to have to apply as we move forward. Because we're building this out of stuff we know, markup and CSS and JavaScript, I think the odds of that are a lot higher. I think we'll be good. And one of the things about JavaScript that's very interesting is that it's not intrinsically a barrier, right? In fact, sometimes it can punch through barriers. And an example of that is something Derek Featherstone did. So Flash movies in browsers. I guess there's a couple of websites devoted to this kind of thing. The problem is that Flash-driven movies are not keyboard accessible, okay? So if you can't use a mouse, and some people who are on the web can't use mice, you can't start a movie or stop a movie or change the volume or any of that kind of stuff, which is really frustrating, I would imagine, if you go to YouTube and you can't start a movie. Or alternatively, if you end up on a YouTube page and you can't stop the movie because it starts automatically, I mean, I get annoyed enough when movies start by themselves and I know I can stop them. I'm still, for that like second and a half before I manage to stop them, really pissed off, right? Stop shouting at me. Okay, so what Derek did, Derek Featherstone, further ahead in Canada, was he wrote JavaScript that would look for Flash movies, and then it would automatically create play and pause buttons, okay? So that these things become keyboard accessible. And then actually with a little bit of JavaScript, he sort of moved them over the little play button so that actually if you're a person who can use a mouse on that page and you're clicking on that play pause button, you're actually accessing those buttons even though you don't realize it, right? Everything just works for you because with JavaScript he could create the controls and then he could also have them talk to the Flash movie to say start or stop, okay? So, you know, like I say, JavaScript doesn't have to be a barrier. So, so what can we do right now? I think the principles of progressive enhancement will really serve us well. As an example, and make this as quick as I can, this little bit of form element stuff actually has a couple of HTML5 features. The autofocus and required attributes. These are HTML5 attributes, but browsers don't support them right now. So with a little bit of JavaScript, like this, and literally like this, you can make it so that autofocus fields get focused, and then with a little bit of CSS, required fields get some kind of styling that indicate that they're required. And of course, that isn't going to work in every single browser, but in the browsers it doesn't work for, nothing will be broken. They just won't get autofocusing or red-backed fields, right? There won't be anything taken away from them. It'll just be what they've always had, whereas in more advanced browsers that can do this sort of thing, the experience is enhanced. There are lots of other things you can do. There are a whole ton of input types, like input type equals email, which means eventually that web browsers will actually be able to do their own client-side validation of email addresses, okay? Right now they don't do that. Lots of us are doing that with JavaScript. So what we could do is just look for type equals email and attach the actions to do the you know, client-side validation. And then for people who don't have JavaScript enabled, well, we had to do the back-end validation anyway, so it's all just there. So we're, you know, adding things. And then eventually, hopefully, what we get to in, let's say, 5 years or 10 years, is that every browser that comes to your website already supports input type equals email, right? You just take the JavaScript away, and it works. Okay. Other examples, getting a little more extreme, there's a jQuery plugin called JSS, which is a little ironic because it stands for JavaScript Style Sheets, which is what Netscape called their original style sheet proposal that competed with the original CSS, but whatever. But what this does is it does basically the same thing that the IE7 script does that Dean Edwards created, but it scans through your style sheet and adds support for, basically makes the browser transparently support any selector type that jQuery understands, which is basically all of them. Okay? There's another plugin for jQuery, which was created by Alexis de Vera, which implements the CSS3 template layout module, okay? Which is a way of defining layouts that do all of the stuff that we really liked about tables without actually having to use table markup and being able to have source order independent content. So with this JavaScript plugin, you can take this and create a layout like that. And the equal height columns on the side are a function of the template layout, not bizarre CSS tricks. Okay? Now, this is really more of an experimental thing, but what this actually points to is that with JavaScript, we can start pushing standards forward at our pace. Okay? Standards development, historically, as in for the entire history of the web, has been predicated on two things: the speed at which working groups do things, and the speed at which browser makers implement things. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of waiting for those two. But with JavaScript, we don't have to wait for them anymore, right? We can do things like implement the CSS3 template layout module and try it out and say, hey, does this work? Or is this completely awful? Okay? We don't have to wait for some browser maker team to decide, all right, we're going to take the plunge and we're going to implement the template layout module, and we're going to hope that it catches on enough that all of that time and energy was worth it, right? We're going to hope that we get a return on that investment and that we don't end up either throwing out or having to maintain this legacy code that nobody really ever uses because the template layout module turned out to be a really horrible idea, right? And we had to spend 6 months implementing it for anyone to find that out. Not anymore, okay? For that matter, there are things like Aaron Gustafson has created a product called Extender. That's how you pronounce ECSS Extender, is Extender, where you can define your own CSS-like properties and values and work at, write in JavaScript what the effects of those will be. So not only can you use this to implement sort of bizarre corners of the CSS spec that nobody's ever gotten around to implementing, but you can make up your own, right? If you think background gradients are a fantastic idea and they're just not anywhere in the CSS spec, but you'd like to be able to just write in CSS-like language, background gradient, and then define a couple of color points in a direction, you can do that with Extender. And if that catches on like wildfire and everyone's like, yes, this is the greatest thing ever, background gradients will be the defining visual feature of Web 3.0, right? Then that's a case where the working group can look at it and say, I guess background gradients are popular. We should put that in the spec, right? Instead of the working group having to sit around saying, what would people like? Anyone got any guesses? Right? Which is how they work. That's how W3C working groups work, for the most part, as they try to figure out where the web should go and then document where they think the web should go. And sometimes that's where the web goes, and sometimes it's not. I refer you to XHTML2. Okay, the web didn't go that direction. Or, there are corners of CSS2 that never got implemented. Okay, so there's actually the ability now for us, right, developers, people who actually, care about the web, which is the people in this room, implementing what's been written down and creating our own stuff, and then possibly having that written down as a spec, and having browsers start to natively support the things that really catch on. And to find out, hey, this module seemed like a good idea on paper, but in practice, totally awful. No one's ever going to use this. And then the working group could stop working on it, in theory. So there's really a fundamental shift happening right now, and it's because of JavaScript, which is kind of the weird thing, which is that instead of a top-down design of the web, there's a possibility of a bottom-up evolution of the web. And I don't mean visually, I mean technologically. And that is one of the most exciting things I think that's happened since the web itself was invented. Because, all of us are smarter than any of us, right? Working together and testing things out. So that's going to make things a lot more complicated, right? But that's not necessarily a bad thing. As Tim Berners-Lee said yesterday, as it turns out, that there's this big shift happening, and it's that things are moving client-side. There's less that has to happen on the server side, or for that matter, in the browser, okay? In the sense of the browser, there's less that has to happen in terms of the browser providing support for stuff. Because of the success of the standards movement, and because of the work that's gone into increasing JavaScript performance and JavaScript interoperability, we actually now can extend the web ourselves. We can push it in directions that nobody has thought of yet. Or just get old browsers to catch the heck up to where we are now, right? Like I said when I started out, the web has won, and it's up to us to make sure that that victory isn't a Pyrrhic one. But I actually have a lot of confidence that because of everything we've learned and because of how much we care about and really love the web, that it's not going to be, and that we will actually launch a revolution over the next 5 years and the web's advancement, that we're all going to look back and say, we did it, and it's awesome. And I can't wait to see what you do in making that happen. Thank you.